So today I want to talk about the concept in all kind of spectrums in and value systems why nothing can be insignificant. Which sounds strange because you think, yes, of course, nothing is insignificant because it's nothing, but I'm talking about the other uh, side of nothing. Not nothing as a concept, but nothing as uh, designating things, no thing. The thing, yes? In the linguistic dimensional reasoning model or dimensional frameworks, when we talk about consciousness development or psychological development or emotional development, we kind of naturally feel, perceive, think, and sense that a being that has full self contained power is very high dimensionally, right? Spiritually speaking. Such a person we regard as even being spiritually higher than, let's say, a guru that still is in need of validation or still in need to show himself, to propagate himself through the world, physically or digital. So by that definition, you can assume that me by being on this video and showing myself signifies the lack of self-contained power. But I compensate for that with having, you know, crystals that kind of give this sense of um, connection to something else, something higher, some part of you that somehow, because of the physicality of our reality, stays obscured, hidden. Now, to go back to a being that is fully self contained power, we think he is very high on the stack. But actually, it creates a kind of loop, right? Because when you go down in consciousness development, right? When you go to a primitive human, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, then you come to, let's say, animals, right? And eventually you come to plant, more primitive consciousnesses. And eventually you come to matter, right? Objects, um, objects in nature, stone, things that doesn't even seem alive, right? And we think, oh, we just use that. We can use that to our liking because it's such a weak thing. A stone, it's such a weak thing in a way. So in terms of consciousness ladder, it is very low thing, right? Even lower than a bad person in a way. However, from a non-dualistic dimensionality perspective, from the operating from the linguistic dimensional reasoning model, it's always a mouthful. That's um, actually what happens is that once you reach the definitions of a consciousness being with self-contained power fully, you actually make a loop back to the lowest, to physical matter. Because if you think about it, this crystal shares very similar definitions to a person. Sorry, there was a slight interruption because because my other phone started doing an AI thingy talking by itself. But to come back, uh, physical objects, they actually have the properties of self-contained power structures. And one thing, okay, yes, of course, it's matter. It is self-contained. That the object is the object. There's no opposition. There's no opposition to a stone other than a non-stone. But then, or there's no opposition to a crystal, because when you say a non-crystal, it still has to apply a crystal, because take away the word crystal and you just have non, that's just, then that no longer applies to the object itself, right? So linguistically also, this is a what this physical matter is a stable object. It's an island of stability in the dimensional stack. And we think it's very low, right? But actually it recurves back to a very high state of consciousness. So in an interesting way, if you were to meditate on an object, physical object, and you start reasoning that the object has self-contained power and other dimensionalities to it as well, this on a causal and conceptual level, and a kind of an essence level, right? For example, this is transparent. Then you can reason all the aspects of transparency. Then you think, wow, wait a minute, all these kind of aspects, they're much higher than on what we psychologically operate. So in some sense, the value system we put on different phenomena in perceived reality starts flipping in a weird way. In that sense, the value system becomes super fluid, because in some sense, the value system has to be dimensionally kind of equalized in causal definitions, right? Because just like an ocean, you can only press down upon one point without creating a massive force of the surrounding to fill the void that it creates. A higher force would need to be able to do that, right? Like a dimensionally higher force or more superimposed force. So when we have this crystal, and crystals are kind of interesting because people feel different things about crystals. Like I have this one here. This is not specifically a crystal, this is a tektite. And you know, like this, for example, this is moldavite. And now, especially when you talk about crystals, for example, but it can be any object. It can be a coffee mug. You know, a coffee mug is an object of self-contained power. So in some ways, if you think about it, we use coffee mugs, we use knives and forks, and they're very useful to us, right? So if you disappear as a conscious object, as a human being, right, from reality, you know, it's far less impactful than if you would remove the very concept of a mug throughout the world, or a container, or a knife, or a fork. Like, we would be, you know, life would get pretty hard for a lot of people when suddenly all spoons disappear, right? A spoonless world. You don't, because we need to spoon, right? Like in the world, you just need spoons to spoon food around, you know? I know that's a funny reference. But yeah, so in that sense, when we think, and by that definition, we can also reason, wait a minute, so if the highest in terms of human emotional, spiritual, and psychological expression is synonym to actually a very lowest state according the value that we assign to it, like a stone, crystal, object, then in theory that fundamental law can apply even to other systems, right? For example, we often regard someone who is famous, someone who is rich, someone who has influence as that being an absolute value, right? That we feel less. However, dimensionally, this actually doesn't really work. Um, it doesn't hold up in mathematics, in energetic systems even. Uh, in terms of the full stack, right? Because obviously uh, power values can be distributed in a different way, but it still kind of needs to be equalized in some way, right? Because otherwise the system becomes very unbalanced, and usually a system needs to be balanced to operate, just like the creation of this physical universe needed a exact calibration of fundamental forces, right? So therefore you can reason, even though you live a simple life, perhaps according to the hyperdimensionality, according to self-folding, non-linear time and space and causalities and events and states of consciousness, perhaps when you move a stone from one place in your room to another, this might create a very big event in some other dimensionalities, or vice versa, right? Which makes a very big thing a very small event somewhere else, because it kind of compensates. And in the end, you can also reason like this, like for you, or even let's say that whether you are a billionaire or you are not a billionaire, you might have a billion, you might have something, many things. You might have €1 billion in the bank. But factually, whether it is a trillion or a billion, it's a couple of zeros extra. Yes? But those are just kind of neuronic memory in your brain. It is not, how to say, you wouldn't feel emotionally different if you are not that attached to it. Of course, physically, if you are twice the size, it's a different story, right? Because that falls under the being. I am bigger than before, yes? But the having is of a much lower order, yes? Because let's say you have €1,000, but you multiply that by 1,000. Oh, now you have €1,000,000. But it's not, doesn't have an effect on the being necessarily. You can do more, you can have more, but on the being per se, yeah, maybe some thinking changes. You can change with the money. You can, I don't know, do surgery or something like that. But fundamentally, perhaps no. But let's say you are 2 meters tall, but you increase your size 1,000 times, then you are 1,000 times taller, right? Well, that has a big effect on everything. I mean, just you'll be like this Godzilla person walking around. So that's obviously a much different thing. Where was I going with this? Yeah, the idea that when we think we are insignificant, it is probably not true, in the same way that a stone is principally and causality wise not insignificant, because it holds so many principles, right? It holds so many causalities. We just see the stone, but if you really start to philosophize about the stone, you can actually deduct many interesting things that you would not deduct from just linear, one-dimensional reasoning, or reasoning just from the perspective of what you see. And this is also synonymous to like ancient yogis that meditate on a thing, and not just by thought, because I'm doing this now through thought, but by concentration and actually penetrating on from the spiritual factors, because now I'm operating from the cognitive factors, but they can also do the same thing from a spiritual factor to to start perceiving the fundamentalities and the causalities of a thing that is concentrated upon. So yeah, in that sense, nothing is insignificant, right? And even like when you see people, often what you feel like they feel very bad about themselves, like they feel they fall short of the expectations of other. But when you really zoom in, they might be some very high soul, much higher than those that they actually want some love from, you know. And you see this a lot. And often it's also because the more conscious people, they would like some they also want love. It's not like if you are a god or something of a very higher understanding order or energetically, you still want the same things. You still want very human things, right? Maybe how you get those things is different. Like if you are a master of on a dimensionality, to collapse the space between consciousness in terms of consciousness self-folding space matrices, yes, then you wouldn't feel lonely because you bridge the space, the empty space between different consciousnesses. And of course, then you are in a favorable position in terms of feeling lonely. So yeah, I think nothing is insignificant. The very small thing, the small gestures. For example, let's say you're a billionaire, right? And you are this rich family, but you never got an ounce of love, right? And then you're somewhere, and a poor person sees you and he gives you an apple while he has two. And you think, I can give this to someone else. That gesture alone might stay for the entire life with that billionaire as the most profound spiritual, emotional, and causal event of his life. So therefore, it flips the value system completely, right? And this actually is completely in line with self-folding dimensionalities to time, space, events, causalities, value system, where a thing flips into the other. And it's somehow, you can say, it makes an eighth loop, an eternal loop, but at one point the value system flips, right? The eternity, the cyclic eternity symbol, right? And actually, I bought a 3D printer, and I wanted to make this kind of flower of life symbol, but with this eternal 8. It's gonna be really beautiful, I would say. You know, you put the lamp behind it, and it's gonna overlap in between it, and or in both. Wow, it would be like magnifique, right? So yes, that's what I wanted to say. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you want to ask a question, you can write in the comments. If you don't want to ask a question, you can still write in the comments that you actually do not want to ask a question. Or you can write in the comments that you want to ask yourself the question, that why you don't want to ask the question. Get it? You can loop yourself so many times that you end up crazy. Yeah, don't do it. Just don't ask the question. Ask questions, but also don't ask the questions. Or ask the questions why you don't ask questions. That's the first part.